Welcome to the Primary Text. I'm Adam. And over the course of this season, we're going to do something ambitious. We're going to read, almost in its entirety, one of the most influential philosophical works ever written. Not summarize it, not give you the highlights, actually read it passage by passage and sit with what we find. The book is The Meditations. The author is Marcus Aurelius. And the question that draws us in is simple. Why did the most powerful man on earth spend his nights writing desperate notes to himself about how to be a decent human being? Picture the scene. It's sometime around 172 CE, the Danube frontier. Winter. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, commands an empire stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Mesopotamia. Legions march at his word. Senators bow before him. The known world bends to his will. And here he is, alone in his tent at 3 a.m, writing by lamplight. But he's not drafting battle plans. He's not composing letters to the Senate. He's reminding himself to get out of bed. He's telling himself not to be angry at difficult people. He's working through yet again how to face the fact that he will die. These private notes were never meant for us. Marcus wrote them for himself in Greek rather than Latin, with a title that translates roughly as to himself or things to oneself. We call them the Meditations, but that title came later. What we have is something far more intimate than a philosophical treatise. We have the internal dialogue of a man trying day after day to live according to his principles. And here's what's extraordinary. Nearly 2,000 years later, these private reminders speak to us. They speak to the executive who can't stop checking email at midnight, to the parent who loses patience with their children, to anyone who has ever known what they should do and found themselves doing something else entirely. The struggles Marcus faced on the Danube frontier are the struggles we face in our own lives, dressed in different clothes. This season, we're going to read his words together. You'll hear Marcus speak through a second voice distinct from mine, so you can clearly distinguish his ancient wisdom from my modern commentary. When you hear that voice, you're hearing the emperor himself reaching across the centuries. By the time we finish, you'll have encountered approximately 90% of the Meditations verbatim. Not my interpretation of it. The actual text. You'll understand not just what Marcus said, but why he said it, how it fits into the larger Stoic tradition, and most importantly, how you might apply it in your own life. But before we can read his words, we need to understand the man who wrote them. We need to know his world, his teachers, his struggles. We need to understand what Stoicism actually is and how it reached a Roman emperor. We need to grasp why this particular book, written for an audience of one, became one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy. That's what this episode is for. Consider it the preparation before the journey. By the end of today, you'll be ready to meet Marcus on his own terms. Let's begin. The man. Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was born on the 26th of April, 121 CE, into one of Rome's most distinguished families. His birth name was Marcus Annius Verus, and he came from Spanish-Roman aristocratic stock. His family had produced senators and consuls for generations. Wealth, influence, and power were his birthright, but something set Marcus apart from an early age. Ancient sources describe a serious child unusually drawn to philosophy. By the age of 12, he had adopted the rough cloak and simple lifestyle of a philosopher, sleeping on a hard bed, eating plain food. His mother had to persuade him that a wooden board was actually too extreme and that a couch covered with skins would serve the philosophical life just as well. And this seriousness caught the attention of the emperor Hadrian, who was looking for a worthy successor. Roman imperial succession was a complicated business. Hadrian had no biological sons, so he adopted Antoninus Pius as his heir, on the condition that Antoninus would in turn adopt 2 boys, Marcus and a younger child named Lucius Verus. The future was being carefully arranged, and so Marcus found himself at 17, the heir to an heir. He would spend the next 23 years preparing for a role he apparently never wanted. The ancient historian Cassius Dio tells us that Marcus accepted the burden of power with reluctance, preferring the life of a scholar to the life of a ruler. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, Marcus became emperor at the age of 39. In an unprecedented move, he immediately elevated his adoptive brother Lucius Verus to co-emperor, sharing power rather than hoarding it. This decision tells us something important about Marcus's character. Power, for him, was responsibility rather than privilege. But the reign that followed would test every philosophical principle Marcus had ever learned. Almost immediately, the Parthian Empire attacked Rome's eastern frontier. Then came the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox carried back by returning legions. It swept through the empire, killing perhaps 5 million people. Some estimates suggest a quarter of the population perished. Then Germanic tribes pushed across the Danube, threatening Italy itself. For most of his reign, Marcus was at war, commanding legions on distant frontiers rather than philosophizing in Rome. It was during these military campaigns, probably between 170 and 180 CE, that Marcus wrote what we now call the Meditations. He wrote them at night, in his tent, surrounded by war and death and the endless responsibilities of empire. This context matters immensely. These are not the comfortable reflections of a scholar in a library. They are the urgent reminders of a man trying to hold himself together under impossible pressure. Marcus was married to Faustina, and together they had at least 13 children. Most died young. Only one son survived to adulthood, Commodus, who would succeed Marcus and become one of Rome's most disastrous emperors. This too is part of the story. The philosopher-emperor who wrote so wisely about virtue and character somehow raised a son who embodied neither. Marcus Aurelius died on the 17th of March, 180 CE at Vindobona, modern-day Vienna. He was 58 years old. According to the sources, his last words to his officers were, "Go to the rising sun, I am already setting." He had spent 19 years as emperor, most of them at war. He had faced plague, invasion, rebellion, and personal tragedy. And through it all, he had written these private notes, wrestling with the same questions that had occupied philosophers for centuries. How should we live? What really matters? How do we face suffering and death? The Meditations opens with something unusual. Before any philosophical teaching, before any Stoic principle, Marcus lists the people who shaped him. Listen to how he begins.
From my grandfather Verus, I learned good morals and the government of my temper. From the reputation and remembrance of my father, modesty and a manly character. From my mother, piety and beneficence and abstinence, not only from evil deeds, but even from evil thoughts, and further, simplicity in my way of living, far removed from the habits of the rich.
Notice what he's doing. The most powerful man in the world begins his private philosophical journal not with his achievements, not with his authority, but with his debts. He lists 17 different people and what he learned from each. His grandfather taught him self-control. His mother taught him simplicity. His teachers taught him to avoid miracle workers and charlatans, to prefer substance over show. The longest entry is for Antoninus Pius, the man who adopted him and whom Marcus served for 23 years before becoming emperor himself. Listen to how Marcus describes his adoptive father.
In my father, I observed mildness of temper and unchangeable resolution in the things which he had determined after due deliberation, and no vainglory in those things which men call honours, and a love of labour and perseverance, and a readiness to listen to those who had anything to propose for the common weal, an undeviating firmness in giving to every man according to his deserts, and a knowledge derived from experience of the occasions for vigorous action and for relaxation.
This goes on for several paragraphs. Marcus catalogues every virtue he observed: Antoninus's simplicity in diet, his patience with incompetent subordinates, his genuine friendships, his careful consideration of public funds, his ability to leave work at work. The portrait that emerges is of an ideal ruler, a model Marcus spent his life trying to emulate. But Book 1 ends with something more personal. Marcus concludes by thanking the gods for all the circumstances of his life.
I thank the gods that I was not longer brought up with my grandfather's concubine, and that I preserved the flower of my youth, and that I did not make proof of my virility before the proper season, but even deferred the time, that I was subjected to a ruler and a father who was able to take away all pride from me, and to bring me to the knowledge that it is possible for a man to live in a palace without wanting either guards or embroidered dresses, or any such things.
Here is the emperor reflecting on what he was spared. He didn't grow up in corrupting circumstances. He learned that a palace doesn't require the trappings of luxury. He found teachers who could strip away his pride. This is gratitude as philosophical practice, not just feeling grateful, but examining the conditions that made a good life possible. This is the man who wrote the Meditations, not a detached sage, but a reluctant emperor surrounded by death and difficulty, trying each day to live up to the examples he had been given. The world. Rome at the turning. To understand the Meditations, we need to understand the world Marcus inhabited. The 2nd century CE is often called the height of Roman power, but it was also the beginning of a long decline. Marcus Aurelius stood at that turning point. The Roman Empire under Marcus stretched across 3 continents. 50 to 60 million people lived under Roman rule, connected by roads, laws, trade, and a common culture. Roman legions held the frontiers from Scotland to Syria. Roman ships dominated the Mediterranean. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water to cities throughout the empire. The era Marcus was born into is sometimes called the Age of the 5 Good Emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius himself. For nearly a century, power had passed relatively smoothly through adoption rather than birth, with each emperor choosing a capable successor. The historian Edward Gibbon famously called this period the most happy and prosperous in human history, but the cracks were already showing. The Antonine Plague, which struck during Marcus's reign, killed millions. Modern scholars believe it may have been the first appearance of smallpox in the Mediterranean world, to which the population had no immunity. The death toll was catastrophic. Whole villages were emptied. The army, which depended on healthy recruits, struggled to fill its ranks. The economy, which depended on labor, faltered. And then there were the wars. Marcus spent most of his reign fighting. The Parthian War in the east, the Marcomannic Wars on the Danube frontier. Germanic tribes pressed against the borders with unprecedented force. For the first time since the reign of Augustus, a hostile army threatened Italy itself. Marcus was aware of living in a particular historical moment. He wrote about it explicitly.
The Asia of Heraclitus and Pythagoras, what has become of it? The Europe of Alexander, what has become of it? The Rome of Nero and Domitian? All things are petty, quickly changing, vanishing away. And present things, consider the same way. All things soon to be narrated as old stories, soon to be buried in complete oblivion.
This is not idle philosophizing. Marcus is watching his world change. The Asia that once belonged to great philosophers and conquerors, the Europe Alexander once ruled, the Rome of earlier emperors, all of it passing, changing, vanishing. He's writing this while defending Roman frontiers against the very forces that would eventually bring the empire down. The intellectual climate of Marcus's Rome was complex. The period is sometimes called the Second Sophistic, a revival of Greek rhetoric and learning. Philosophy flourished, but often as competitive display rather than genuine inquiry. Different schools debated publicly: Stoics, Epicureans, Platonists, Aristotelians, Cynics. Wealthy Romans hired philosophers as tutors and advisors. Philosophy was fashionable, even if genuine philosophical living was rare. There's something else we should acknowledge honestly. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher of compassion and common humanity, also persecuted Christians. We don't have evidence that he initiated persecutions himself, but they occurred under his authority, most notably in 177 CE, where Christians were tortured and killed in the arena. This sits uncomfortably with the tolerant, reflective figure of the Meditations. Marcus wrote about universal brotherhood and the kinship of all rational beings, yet his empire killed people for their religious beliefs. This contradiction doesn't invalidate his philosophy, but it does remind us that Marcus was a man of his time, with all the limitations that implies. Even the best intentions don't always translate into just actions. Even genuine wisdom doesn't automatically produce consistent behavior. This is part of what makes Marcus human and relevant. He struggled, like all of us, to live according to his principles. The tradition. Stoicism's journey. Marcus Aurelius didn't invent his philosophy. He inherited it, transformed it, and applied it with an intensity few have matched. To understand the Meditations, we need to understand Stoicism. Stoicism began around 300 BCE in Athens, founded by a man named Zeno of Citium. Zeno taught in a public colonnade called the Stoa, or painted porch. His followers became known as Stoics, people of the porch. The early Stoics developed a comprehensive philosophical system covering logic, physics, and ethics. They believed in a rational universe governed by logos, a divine reason or natural law that permeates everything. Human beings, possessing reason themselves, are fragments of this cosmic rationality. Our purpose is to align our individual reason with universal reason, to live according to nature. Stoic ethics focused on what they called the dichotomy of control. Some things are within our power, some things are not. Our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, these are up to us. Our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, external events, these are not entirely within our control. Wisdom lies in recognizing the difference and directing our efforts accordingly. Over the centuries, Stoicism evolved. It spread from Greece to Rome, and in that crossing it became more practical, more focused on ethics, less concerned with the technical physics and logic that had occupied the early school. Roman Stoics were interested in how to live, not in debating the nature of the universe, and 3 Roman Stoics tower above the rest: Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Each represents a different social position. Seneca was an advisor to emperors, wealthy and politically entangled. Marcus was the emperor himself. But Epictetus was a former slave. Epictetus' story is remarkable. Born into slavery around 50 CE, he was owned by Epaphroditus, himself a former slave, who had risen to become secretary to the Emperor Nero. Epictetus was eventually freed and became a teacher of Stoic philosophy, first in Rome and then in exile in Nicopolis in Greece. His teachings survive through the notes of his student Arrian, collected as the Discourses in the Enchiridion, or Handbook. Listen to how Epictetus opens the Enchiridion.
Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing.
When Epictetus says these things are not within our power, he's speaking from experience. His master could do whatever he wanted to Epictetus's body. Ancient sources suggest his leg was permanently injured, perhaps deliberately broken. But his judgments, his assent, his inner life, these remained his own. The philosophy isn't abstract. It was forged in the reality of enslavement. Marcus Aurelius never met Epictetus, who died before Marcus reached adulthood, but Marcus encountered his teachings through one of his own teachers, a man named Junius Rusticus. In Book 1 of the Meditations, Marcus describes what Rusticus gave him.
From Rusticus, I received the impression that my character required improvement and discipline, and from him I learned not to be led astray to sophistic emulation, nor to writing on speculative matters, nor to delivering little hortatory orations, nor to showing myself off as a man who practices much discipline, or does benevolent acts in order to make a display. And I learned from him to read carefully, and not to be satisfied with a superficial understanding of a book. And from him I learned to know the discourses of Epictetus, which he communicated to me out of his own collection.
The discourses of Epictetus, which he communicated to me out of his own collection. This is how Stoicism reached the emperor, through a teacher who had a private copy of lecture notes from a former slave. The philosophy passed from enslaved man to aristocrat to future emperor, not through formal schools or official channels, but through relationship and transmission. This lineage matters. Marcus is not inventing Stoicism. He's receiving it, practicing it, struggling with it. The Meditations is not a textbook, but a practice journal, showing us what it looks like when someone actually tries to live these principles day after day. The Stoics organized their ethical practice around what later scholars call the 3 disciplines. The discipline of desire concerns what we want and don't want. The discipline of action concerns how we behave toward others. The discipline of assent concerns how we interpret the impressions and appearances that strike our minds. All 3 run throughout the Meditations, though Marcus never names them explicitly. He's not writing a treatise. He's doing the work. The text, to Eis Heuten. Now we come to the book itself. What exactly are we reading when we read the Meditations? The title Meditations is a later invention. In Greek, the work is called ta eis heoton, which translates as to himself, or things to oneself. This title tells us something essential. Marcus was writing to himself for himself. These are not lectures or letters, they are reminders, exercises, self-exhortations. We are reading over someone's shoulder, eavesdropping on an internal conversation never meant for our ears. The work consists of 12 books of varying length. Book 1 is the catalog of debts we've already discussed. Books 2 through 12 contain philosophical reflections arranged without obvious systematic order. Some sections are a single sentence, others run for several paragraphs. Themes repeat, circle back, appear suddenly, and vanish. There were no chapter divisions in the original. The numbered sections we use today were added by later editors to help readers navigate the text. The structure, such as it is, seems to reflect the circumstances of composition. Marcus wrote when he could, where he could, perhaps over a period of 10 years. The result is something like a philosophical journal, accreting over time rather than following a planned outline. We don't know exactly when or where each part was written. Some manuscripts include notations like written among the Quadi, referring to a Germanic tribe Marcus was fighting on the Danube. But these notations may be later additions, and their reliability is disputed. What seems clear is that most of the work was composed during the last decade of Marcus's life, during his military campaigns far from Rome. The text survived through Byzantine manuscripts, copied by medieval scribes who apparently found value in these pagan reflections. The first printed edition appeared in 1559. Since then, the Meditations has been translated into every major language and has never gone out of print. For a private notebook never meant for publication, it has had an extraordinary afterlife. To hear what Marcus sounds like when he's writing to himself, listen to this passage where he catches himself complaining about getting out of bed.
At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work, as a human being. What do I have to complain of, if I'm going to do what I was born for, the things I was brought into the world to do? Or is this what I was created for, to huddle under the blankets and stay warm?
Then he imagines his own objection.
But it's nicer here.
And responds to himself.
So you were born to feel nice, instead of doing things and experiencing them? Don't you see the plants, the birds, the ants, and spiders and bees going about their individual tasks, putting the world in order as best they can? And you're not willing to do your job as a human being? Why aren't you running to do what your nature demands?
This is the texture of the Meditations. Marcus talking to himself, catching his own excuses, pushing back against his own resistance. The philosophy isn't announced from on high. It emerges in the struggle to actually live it. Or listen to this, where Marcus reminds himself how to interpret the people who frustrate him.
When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. No one can implicate me in ugliness, nor can I feel angry at my relative, or hate him.
Notice the structure. First, he acknowledges reality. People will be difficult. Then he reframes, they act this way from ignorance, not malice. Then he shifts perspective. We share the same rational nature. Then he draws the conclusion, therefore anger and hatred are inappropriate. This is Stoic practice in action. Not denying difficulty, but working with it. Not pretending people are better than they are, but finding reasons for compassion anyway. Not suppressing emotion, but transforming how we see the situation so that destructive emotions don't arise in the first place. One more example. Here Marcus confronts his own mortality directly.
Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. What doesn't transmit light creates its own darkness.
This is memento mori, the meditation on death. But notice how Marcus uses it. Not to create despair, but to create urgency. If your life is already over, then every remaining moment is a gift. What will you do with it? The text we're going to read together over this season is full of passages like these. Some will resonate immediately, others may seem strange or repetitive, some will comfort you, others will challenge you. That's as it should be. Marcus wasn't writing to entertain, he was writing to transform himself. The question is whether his self-transformation can assist our own. The themes. What we'll discover. Throughout the meditations, certain themes appear again and again. Marcus returns to them from different angles and different moods at different stages of his reflection. Before we begin reading the text itself, let me preview 7 major themes we'll encounter throughout this season. The first is death and impermanence. Marcus thinks about death constantly, not morbidly, but practically. He contemplates the deaths of emperors, philosophers, physicians. Everyone who ever lived is now gone. Everything we build will crumble. Every reputation will be forgotten. But rather than paralyzing him, this awareness liberates him. If nothing lasts, then what matters is how we live right now. If we're going to die anyway, we might as well live well in the meantime.
Survey the courses of the stars as if you were moving with them, and constantly consider the transformations of the elements into one another. For such thoughts wash away the dirt of our life on the ground.
The second theme is the view from above. Marcus regularly lifts his perspective from the immediate to the cosmic. He imagines looking down on human affairs from a great height, seeing the patterns rather than the details. From up there, our troubles seem smaller, our achievements less significant, our conflicts less urgent. This isn't escapism, it's therapy. By stepping back, we gain the distance needed to respond wisely rather than react blindly. The third theme is the inner citadel. This is Marcus's image for the self that cannot be invaded, the core of our being that remains untouched by external circumstance. Events happen to us, but they don't define us. Other people can affect our bodies and our reputations, but they cannot touch our judgments, our values, our character. That innermost self is ours to protect and cultivate.
People seek retreats for themselves in the country, by the sea, in the mountains. You, too, are inclined to desire such things very much. But this is altogether unphilosophical, when it is possible, at any hour you please, to retreat into yourself. For nowhere can a man retire with more quiet or freedom from trouble than into his own soul.
The fourth theme is social duty, despite frustration. Marcus was not a hermit. He was an emperor surrounded constantly by people who annoyed, disappointed, and frustrated him. The Meditations is full of his struggles with difficult people, but his conclusion is always the same. We are social beings made to work together. Even when others fail us, our job is to serve the common good. We cannot control how others behave. We can only control how we respond. The fifth theme is the distinction between opinion and reality. The Stoics taught that we are disturbed not by events themselves, but by our judgments about events. If someone insults me, the insult itself is just sound waves in air. The pain I feel comes from my interpretation. This person disrespected me. This is intolerable. I must respond. Marcus constantly returns to this insight. Most of our suffering is self-created through the stories we tell ourselves about what happens to us.
If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment.
The sixth theme is obstacle as path. This has become perhaps the most famous idea from the Meditations popularized in recent years. The basic insight is that difficulties are not merely obstacles to overcome, but opportunities to develop virtue. The very thing that stands in our way becomes the way forward. Patience is developed through dealing with impatient situations. Courage is developed by facing what frightens us. Every impediment is also an invitation.
The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way.
The seventh theme is present moment focus. For Marcus, the only time that truly exists is now. The past is gone, unchangeable. The future hasn't arrived and may never come. Only the present moment is real, and only in the present can we act. This focus on the immediate isn't about ignoring consequences or avoiding planning. It's about recognizing where life actually happens. We can remember the past and imagine the future, but we can only live now.
Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present.
These 7 themes interweave throughout the meditations. They appear in different combinations applied to different situations developed with varying levels of depth. Over the coming episodes, we'll watch Marcus return to them again and again, each time adding nuance or addressing a new application. The approach. Philosophy as practice. Before we begin reading, a word about how to engage with what we're about to encounter. The Meditations is not a book to be read passively. Marcus didn't write it to inform us, but to transform himself. The passages we'll hear are not arguments to evaluate, but practices to try. This is philosophy in the ancient sense, not a subject to study, but a way of life to embody. So as we move through this season, I want to suggest some ways you might engage actively rather than merely listening. First, consider keeping your own journal. What if you wrote your own meditations, not copying Marcus, but doing what Marcus did? Writing reminders to yourself, catching your own patterns, working through your own struggles. You don't need to share it with anyone. It's for yourself, like Marcus's was for himself. Second, try the practices. When Marcus describes his morning preparation, expecting to meet difficult people, try it yourself. When he suggests the view from above, imagining your troubles from cosmic perspective, actually do it. Philosophy is like exercise. Hearing about it doesn't make you stronger. You have to do the work. Third, notice your resistance. There will be passages that annoy you, that seem wrong, that you want to argue with. Good. Pay attention to that. Your resistance tells you something about yourself. Marcus didn't agree with everything his teachers taught him. He took what was useful and transformed it. You can do the same. Fourth, sit with what's difficult. Some of what Marcus writes is dark. He thinks about death constantly. He catalogs the worthlessness of fame and achievement. He can seem pessimistic, even depressed. Don't rush past this. The darkness is part of the teaching. Marcus isn't trying to make us feel good. He's trying to show us what's real so we can build our lives on solid ground. In this podcast, you'll hear Marcus's own words through a second voice. When that voice speaks, you're hearing the primary text itself, in translation. When I speak, I'm offering context, interpretation, application. But the heart of what we're doing is letting Marcus speak. My job is to help you hear him more clearly, not to replace his voice with my own. The season, what lies ahead. Let me give you a brief preview of where we're going. Next episode, we'll read Book 1 in its entirety. This is Marcus's catalog of debts, his acknowledgement of everyone who shaped him. It's unlike anything else in the Meditations, and it sets the stage for everything that follows. Episodes 3 through 5 cover books 2 through 4. These are foundational. Here Marcus establishes his core practices: the morning preparation, the evening review, the inner retreat, the view from above. If you understand these books, you understand the heart of Stoic practice. Episodes 6 through 9 cover books 5 through 8. This is philosophy in action. Marcus wrestles with resistance, with difficult people, with the discipline of perception. The themes deepen, the applications multiply. Episodes 10 through 13 cover books 9 through 12. This is integration. Marcus brings together everything he's been practicing. The cosmic perspective expands. The mature soul is described. The discipline of desire reaches its culmination in what the Stoics called amor fati, loving one's fate. Our final episode will synthesize the whole work, answer your questions, and look at where the meditations might take us next. Throughout, I want to hear from you. What resonates? What confuses you? What do you disagree with? Send your thoughts to the primary text at maaoot.org. Your questions shape these episodes. This isn't a monologue. It's a conversation across time, and you're part of it. The invitation. So here we are at the beginning. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a Roman emperor sat in his tent on the Danube frontier and wrote to himself about how to live. He wrestled with getting out of bed, with difficult colleagues, with the inevitability of death. He reminded himself again and again of the principles he was trying to embody. He failed constantly and kept trying anyway. His private notebook survived. Somehow, through the centuries, these personal reminders found their way to us, and they still speak. They speak because the human struggles Marcus faced are the struggles we face. The questions he asked are the questions we ask. The practices he developed actually work. I want to leave you with one final passage. This is perhaps the most famous line in the Meditations, and it captures everything Marcus was trying to do.
Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one.
That's the invitation. Not to debate philosophy, but to live it. Not to admire virtue from a distance, but to embody it. Not to wait until conditions are perfect, but to begin now, today, with whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. Marcus Aurelius never expected us to read his notes. He wrote them for himself, to help himself become the person he was trying to be. But here we are, 2 millennia later, still finding wisdom in his words. Next time, we begin in earnest. Book 1, Debts and Lessons, the most powerful man on earth, beginning with gratitude. Until then, I'm Adam. This is the primary texts. The wisdom you seek has always been within you. You're not learning it. You're remembering it.